The siren rose like a blade across the hive, a drawn-out metallic shriek that rattled rivets loose in the ceiling and set teeth buzzing in the jaw. It was not music, not warning, but a summons. Shift change. Men and women stirred from their bunks as though jolted by current, their bodies moving before their minds had quite left the safety of shallow sleep. In the Manufactorum, the rhythm of existence was dictated by klaxon, bell, and the chanting voice of a priest whose tone never faltered, no matter how many died between dawn and dusk. I remember it well, for I was one of them once. Pressed into the guard after years spent in those furnaces, my lungs already darkened before I ever smelled battlefield smoke. The air tasted of rust and of oil. Each inhalation carried motes of ash so fine they lodged beneath the eyelid and stung until tears carved channels through the grime. Boots clanged down gantries, lines of bodies forming without speech. None dared linger. The overseers watched with augmetic eyes, tallying lateness in margins that could condemn a man faster than heresy. At shift change, mercy did not exist. The Manufactorum measured only output. If your body failed to keep pace, you were subtracted. What we produced there was munitions, though we rarely saw the finished shells. Each worker touched a fragment of the process. Rivet, casing, propellant, primer. The whole was hidden, divided across dozens of lines so that no single man held comprehension. Knowledge was danger. Better to press one lever endlessly, to weld one seam again and again until the movement blurred into prayer. The priest told us that each completed action was an offering to the machine god, that to falter was to insult the Omnissiah himself. I remember whispering the litany while my arms shook from exhaustion, not from belief but from fear that failing to mouth the words would mark me. There was little conversation. Speech wasted breath, and breath was costly in halls where the atmosphere recyclers coughed more often than they cleared. Faces blurred into a gray mass distinguished only by scars and coughs. We were living extensions of the press and the lathe, flesh willing itself to be metal. Some would laugh, dry as rust, when a newcomer still spoke of dreams. The Manufactorum had no space for dreams. It devoured them faster than bodies. Even then, the horror lingered beneath the surface. Rumors moved faster than sanctioned bulletins. A worker gone missing overnight, his name struck from records before dawn. A furnace sealed for maintenance, though its smoke was a different color, bitter and acrid. Overseers warned us against speculation, yet the silence that followed was louder than any rumor. I recall thinking that the Manufactorum was not simply a place of work. It was a mouth, vast and patient, and we were swallowed daily. The siren always ended abruptly, cutting off in mid-scream. When silence fell, it was not peace, it was command. The shift began, and another measure of life was tithed to the machine. Worse was coming. The Manufactorum was not merely an engine of industry, it was a cathedral without windows, its walls reverberating with hymns sung in unison with the grinding of gears. The priests of the machine god walked among us, red robes trailing through oil and soot, their voices echoing in monotone as they recited the catechisms of ignition and pressure. They blessed the presses with sacred oils that smelled no different from the lubricants we used to keep the cogs from seizing. To question the difference was to court accusation. Every lever pulled, every seam welded was framed as worship. The act itself mattered less than the intent assigned to it by doctrine. The Manufactorum's creed was efficiency sanctified, obedience made holy. I remember how the litanies accompanied every task. Before a worker struck steel against steel, he would mutter the benediction of force. Before the press descended to shape casing, someone intoned the canticle of precision. Failure to utter the words drew reprimands harsher than failing to meet quota. The rhythm of work became indistinguishable from prayer, and in time the distinction ceased to matter. Even those who scoffed in private bowed their heads in public. The Manufactorum tolerated fatigue, but it did not tolerate disbelief. The priests themselves were more machine than man. Their hands gleamed with augmetic claws, their eyes replaced with lenses that whirred when they focused on us. They moved without hurry, yet no one ever seemed able to avoid their gaze. One priest in particular, known only as Liturgist Cran, kept a tally stick etched with names. It was whispered that he wrote down those who faltered, and though no one ever saw the punishments carried out, those names seldom reappeared on shift rolls. His presence was enough to steady arms trembling from exhaustion. For a guardsman who once labored under that gaze, the front lines seemed almost merciful. Their death came from enemy fire, visible and sudden. In the Manufactorum, it was drawn out across years, a slow unraveling of flesh and will disguised as service. And yet, indoctrination was complete. I remember men weeping when machinery stalled, not from fear of punishment, but from the conviction that they had failed their God. The line between worship and work was erased, and in that erasure lay the first seeds of corruption. For the more sacred the ritual became, the more brittle it grew. I recall the day when the presses faltered, stuttering under the strain of overuse. Sparks cascaded like false blessings, and for a moment the litany faltered on 1,000 lips. It was then that the silence became dangerous, for silence suggested doubt, and doubt was the true heresy. The priests doubled their chants, voices rising to drown out the failing rhythm of the machine. We followed, terrified, our words shaking as much as our hands. It was never asked aloud what might happen if the litanies failed altogether. That question was buried beneath sermons, beneath lashings, beneath fear. But even then I felt its weight pressing against the silence. Something waited for the day when prayer could no longer disguise weakness. Control in the Manufactorum was not delegated lightly. Overseers stalked the gantries like predators, their augmetic eyes scanning for hesitancy, for the faintest sign of misalignment between body and machine. Their presence was constant but invisible, a pressure applied evenly across every shoulder, every knuckle, every pair of trembling hands. Commissars moved more deliberately, firearms slung at the hip, their words clipped and precise, enforcing the codex of obedience with a threat that required no demonstration. One knew instinctively that hesitation could cost not just one's life, but the continuity of the production line. I remember Overseer Varric, whose left arm had been replaced with a press-forging augmetic limb. He walked the floor with a mechanical hum, his hand striking the polished metal catwalk to mark each step. His eyes, one lens and one human, scanned the ranks for failure. He never spoke unless it was to issue an edict. When he did, his words were final. A man's fate was assigned, not argued. Workers whispered that Varric had survived a furnace collapse that should have flattened the floor, yet some claimed his body had never been the same afterward. Halves of flesh fused with augmetics, a warning carved into living form. Punishments were meted swiftly. Missed quotas brought lashes, or in the case of repeated failure, immediate removal from the floor. I recall one conscript, barely 17, whose hands shook while threading rivets. He coughed into his sleeve, blood spotting the machinery beneath, and the commissar called him out. His confession was coerced, one false admission of negligence, and the man was executed before the line could restart. Others were forced to continue work while his body was removed, as though to show that production mattered more than mortality. Yet the oversight extended beyond physical punishment. Audits were performed constantly, tally sticks, ledgers, and the inscrutable markings of priests counting pious repetitions. Every action recorded, every failure catalogued. Even rumors were a form of control. If a worker dared to discuss sickness in the ranks, the overseer's response was swift and silent, names stricken, quarters reassigned, Whispers stopped before they reached comprehension. It was a lattice of power, layered and impenetrable, where the line between duty and terror blurred. The most unsettling aspect was the quiet suggestion that the overseers themselves were already failing. Varick's arm occasionally sparked, his eye lens fogging, a minor misalignment unnoticed by few. I began to realize that the guardians of order were themselves mortal, their bodies as vulnerable to the Manufactorum's rhythms as ours. The machine demanded consistency, and any inconsistency, human or augmetic, was dangerous. What this meant for us on the floor was simple. Vigilance was mandatory, but certainty was impossible. It was a lesson that shaped every day. We learned not only to follow orders, but to anticipate them, to read the subtle cues of body and posture that hinted at reprisal. And in that anticipation, the seeds of dread were sown. For the question lingered unspoken but felt: if even the enforcers could fail, what would become of those at the mercy of the line? The answer, I suspected, would reveal itself soon. The food queue formed before the end of each shift, a slouching line of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering lumen strips and rusted feeding hatches. No words passed between us, not out of discipline, but exhaustion. Conversation was an indulgence the Manufactorum did not allow. Each breath was hoarded, each glance weighed for risk. The smell of coolant and charred metal clung to every worker, but it was the reek of the rations that turned the stomach. Wet, brick-sized portions of nutrient slurry, gray and steaming, ladled without care into tin bowls already rimmed in soot. It was said that the slurry was made from rendered protein harvested from off-world algae tanks. It was also said that the slurry was made from the remains of those who failed the line. No one dared to confirm either version. I ate because my body demanded it, not because I could stomach the truth. Hunger blurred the line between revulsion and necessity. You learn not to taste. You learn not to look too long into the bowls of those beside you. The ration tiers were enforced by color-coded tokens: red for full-shift laborers, yellow for partials, black for disciplinary. The black tokens received portions thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl through. Those on black usually did not last the week. Some begged for trades, others vanished. No one asked where they went. Survival meant pretending you hadn't seen them at all. One day, the line moved slower than usual. The guards at the hatch exchanged words with a figure in mechanicus robes. We watched, unblinking, as 2 new crates were brought in. Unmarked, dark metal, still moist with condensation. The priest laid a censer wand across the lid of one and whispered a brief rite. Then the hatch opened, and the smell changed. A sharp tang beneath the usual rot, a sweetness that didn't belong. The slurry that day was different. Slicker, almost gelatinous, with a faint shimmer beneath the top layer. Most didn't notice or pretended not to, but I did. And I watched as 3 men in line ahead of me coughed after swallowing it. Deep, wet hacks that left blood on their lips. The commissar watching us said nothing. The overseer at the hatch smiled once, just barely. I traded my bowl away that night, pretending to be ill. I told myself it was cowardice. But the next morning, half my bunkmates did not rise for shift. One had died in his sleep. His veins darkened, stomach bloated. The others were dragged away before morning bells. The bodies left a residue on the floor that the servitors scraped in silence. There was no bulletin, no explanation. The shift resumed. The slurry returned to its usual gray. But the sweetness never quite left the back of my throat. It lingered there still, phantom and persistent, long after I was conscripted. I learned then, even hunger had a hierarchy, and death was just another cost, folded quietly into the logistics of survival. Before each shift, we recited the Catechism of Purity. The words were stamped onto tin placards above the assembly line, etched deep into the metal as if fearing they might be forgotten. Clean hands, clean heart, clean code, we intoned. The sin of rust begins within. It was not optional. Every worker, from the newest conscript to the half-deaf line veteran with rivet burns across his chest, spoke the catechism before laying hand to machine. To falter in the words was to invite suspicion. To question them was to invite disappearance. Purity was more than hygiene. It was a total state of being, defined and enforced by the priesthood. We were expected to scour ourselves before shift, not with water, scarce and rationed, but with powdered ash mixed into gritty paste. The ash came from burned rags, discarded papers, once even a crate of banned data slates. A symbol, we were told, cleansing through destruction. But when the paste began to irritate skin and leave lesions, the priests merely added another line to the chant. Blessed are those who suffer the abrasion of correction. I remember Garen. He worked beside me for 4 shifts, older, stronger, quiet, a dependable man who never spoke out of turn. One morning he coughed blood onto the edge of the lathe, just a drop, dark and slick. He wiped it quickly, eyes wide. But Varric saw. He said nothing then. He simply made a mark in his ledger and moved on. Garen was gone by nightfall. We were told that Garen had violated the doctrine of bodily integrity. His cough, they claimed, was a sign of inner corruption. His removal was necessary to preserve sanctity. We were made to kneel beside his vacant station, chanting the lament of the broken seal. A commissar stood behind us with bolt pistol drawn. I remember my lips trembling as I spoke. I remember the cold sweat beneath my collar. I remember looking at the smear of blood still left on the lathe's baseplate, never fully cleaned. From that day forward, every cough was a confession. Every wince, every sneeze, every poorly hidden tremor was an indictment waiting to be read. The Catechism of Purity became a blade we turned on ourselves. Workers who coughed too often vanished. Those who limped too noticeably were reassigned to furnace duty, rarely seen again. We stopped helping each other. Aiding the impure was complicity. Better to be cruel than to be condemned. What none of us said aloud was this. More were coughing now. The paste burned deeper. The ration lines shortened not from speed but from absences. We saw, but we did not speak. Instead, we prayed louder. We scrubbed until skin cracked. We swallowed coughs until they burst in blood. I began to dream of Garen, his silence, his sudden absence, the way no one said his name again. In the Manufactorum, memory itself was impure. I learned that purity was not cleanliness. It was erasure, and something inside the walls was eager to keep us clean. The crack began as a sound, subtle at first, a thin, metallic groan beneath the furnace's usual roar. Most mistook it for stress settling in the walls. But I had worked long enough to know the difference between the language of machines and the speech of failure. This was not settling. This was strain. And the Manufactorum was listening. Furnace 10 was the oldest on the line, its outer casing blackened by centuries of heat, reinforced with rivets older than any man still working. We were told it had never ceased burning. Not during floods, not during raids, not even when the upper hive collapsed 3 decades prior. Its uninterrupted fire was a symbol, we were told, of the Omnissiah's endurance. That morning, Furnace 10 wept. I was manning the auxiliary intake valve when the tremor hit, sharp, vertical, like something deep beneath had shifted. The floor buckled, pipes screamed, and then came the sound of metal parting. Not a break, a tear, a rending howl that silenced every chant and froze every hand. A gout of pressurized steam burst from Furnace 10's spine, followed by a slow, belching plume of green-gray smoke. It moved like it had weight, The emergency klaxons failed to trigger. Overseers barked orders that clashed, contradicting each other. Seal the valve. Purge the ducts. Keep working. None of us moved. We watched as the smoke rolled low along the floor, curling around boots, creeping up legs. It carried a stench I'd never smelled before, like rotted insulation steeped in formaldehyde. One man, Torvik, collapsed where he stood, hands clawing at his throat. No wounds, no warning, just a silent, shuddering death. Then others began to fall. Some convulsed, others vomited black foam. One woman dropped to her knees and began whispering to something we couldn't see. Her words were fluid, incoherent, more like machine code than prayer. The priest didn't stop her. They didn't speak at all. Liturgist Kran turned and walked away, disappearing into the upper ducts without issuing a single rite. Varric stayed. He moved through the smoke without his respirator, eyes blinking out of sync. His augmetic arm twitched violently, hammering the wall beside him in some corrupted pattern. He stared directly at me once. Just once. And for the first time I saw something close to pleading in the human half of his face. Then the eye fogged over. The twitching stopped. He collapsed like a marionette cut from the strings. The silence that followed was not total. It was filled with the hiss of the furnace, still burning, still alive, but everything else stopped. Work, movement, speech. We were statues ringed by gas and death and dread. The machine did not mourn. It did not pause. The fire within Furnace 10 remained steady, unbothered. We did not speak of what happened. We were ordered not to. Production resumed by nightfall. Those of us who remained stood back in our stations, hands trembling. But I knew something had slipped the seal. Not just gas, not just death. Something else had bled into us. And it had no intention of leaving. It began during mid-shift, 12 hours after the breach. The line was running again, barely. The overseers barked faster than the machines moved, and more than half the usual positions were unfilled. Those of us who remained had been given masks, thin cloth soaked in something acrid that stung the throat worse than the smoke had. We were told the incident was localized pressure deviation. Nothing more. No rites of mourning were offered, no dead named. But the dead did not stay still. Hendrik was the first. I saw him slump mid-motion, his arms still raised in position over the bolt feed conveyor. He didn't fall. He stayed upright, twitching slightly, head tilted back like he was trying to drink from the air. When Varn approached, he turned. Not with confusion, not with pain, just turned with a slowness that felt rehearsed. His eyes were fully dilated, his mouth slack. Then he lunged. It took 3 men to subdue him. When they pinned him, he screamed, not in pain, but in binary code. Sharp syllables spat like orders from a corrupted vox. He bit through his own tongue. Blood soaked the floor. Hendrik died foaming, convulsing, body arching into shapes that no one could explain. His limbs locked into place, rigid and humming. His corpse stayed warm for hours and no one dared remove it. By the next cycle, 5 more had collapsed. Some twitched, others turned violent. One clawed at his face until his skull split. Another tore a metal rod from the assembler and drove it into his own stomach without flinching. The commissars acted with ritual calm, bolt rounds to the head, clean, final. But they could not shoot fast enough. Whatever had been released was not a sickness. It was something deeper, and it was not content to merely kill. Those of us still standing began to understand the true role of the catechisms. They had not been prayers. They were containment. Each chant, each purity rite, each enforced silence had held something back, not from outside but from within. When Furnace 10 cracked, it wasn't just metal that broke, it was the rhythm. And through that rupture something crawled in, or perhaps crawled out. The smoke was gone now, but the change lingered. The air tasted electric. Machinery pulsed louder, as if fed by more than power. I looked at my hands once and swore they trembled in time with the stamping presses. Perfect. Syncopation. Unnatural and precise. We were becoming part of it. Not metaphorically, mechanically. The priests did not return. Overseers spoke only in monosyllables. Varick's name was not mentioned again. The Manufactorum continued as if its limbs had been severed but still expected to walk. That night I didn't sleep. None of us did. There was no bell for rest, no signal for recovery. Only the endless, seamless hum of production. And above it all, something new. A low-frequency pulse beneath the floor plates, steady and growing louder. A second heartbeat, not ours. By the next cycle, the doors were sealed. Not locked, sealed, welded from the outside. Quarantine banners were draped across the gantries, their fibers soaked in incense and stitched with hex symbols. A proclamation was read from a Vox emitter mounted above the mess hatch. By decree of the Office of Interior Integrity, Manufactorum Unit 287 Theta is under environmental containment. All personnel are to remain at stations, further instruction pending. The voice was synthetic, genderless, without cadence. No one spoke when it ended. We understood what it meant. We were not to be rescued. We were to be contained. Outside the airlocks, I glimpsed the flicker of hazard teams in full rebreather gear. Non-regulation models white with black visors. They moved without pause, welding seams, reinforcing bulkheads. No one addressed us, no one made eye contact. Whatever had occurred inside was not to be shared with the wider hive. We were cordoned like infection, forgotten like waste. The interior atmosphere changed within hours. The already thin air grew warmer, denser as the circulation system shifted into low cycle mode. We sweated through our uniforms, hands slipping on levers, vision swimming. The slurry ration was cut in half and delivered through sealed ducts. Masks were no longer optional. They were handed out by servitors, each stamped with a fresh purity seal. We were told to wear them even while sleeping. Those who resisted were simply removed. Two refused the masks. They claimed the fabric stank of old coolant and that it burned their throats. One tried to rip his off mid-shift, screaming that the lining was whispering to him. A commissar approached, placed a hand on his shoulder, and walked him into the shadows between reactors. He never came back. No questions were asked. We had already learned the lesson. Every movement became ritual. We obeyed not because we believed, but because disobedience offered no alternative. The Manufactorum no longer resembled a place of work. It was a sealed biome of rust, sweat, and silence. The heartbeats beneath the floor grew louder, almost felt rather than heard. We tried to speak of it, what it meant, what it might be, but words failed. The deeper truth was ineffable, and perhaps that was the point. Then came the bricking. Certain corridors were deemed unstable, entire subsectors of the Manufactorum, dozens of workers still, inside, were walled off in the night by remote servitor units. We heard their banging, the cries behind reinforced plasteel, the scratching. By morning, nothing. Just smooth walls and silence. I passed one the next shift. A smear of blood had seeped under the doorframe. It had dried in a perfect half-circle like an inverted halo. There was no pretense of order anymore. No one inspected the lines. No quotas were checked. No sermons played. But we continued. Hands moving out of reflex, breath rasping through chemical-filtered cloth. We worked not to live, but because movement was the only thing that kept us from listening too closely to the hum beneath our feet. It was no longer faint. It was hungry. And it was learning our rhythm. They called it the reclamation of fault. A new ritual, born not from scripture but from panic dressed as piety. Each shift began with confession. Compulsory, personal, public. We were ordered to line up beneath the intake cranes where a black-robed commissar and a scribe mechanic awaited us. One by one, we stepped forward and named our failings. Not in silence, not in privacy, loudly, clearly, so all could hear. Hesitation was noted, refusal was punished. The floor beneath the platform had been reinforced with drainage grates. None of us asked why. We confessed to small things at first, a dropped bolt, a stutter in the morning chant, a delay in valve pressure equalization. But soon the demands grew. "Confess your thoughts," the commissar said. "Speak of what dreams have tempted you." A man ahead of me began to cry. He said he had dreamed of green fields, of open air, of children laughing in light. He was shot in the back of the head before his voice reached the word son. His blood ran between the grates without resistance. The commissar turned to the next man in line and said, "Continue." After that, we learned to shape our sins properly. We confessed impure thoughts about inefficiency, about sloth, about failing to adore the Omnissiah with sufficient fervor. We made our heresies useful, moldable. We turned our inner lives into weapons against ourselves. The scribe mechanic recorded every word, the quill in its mechadendrite flicking across parchment faster than any human hand. And though none of us ever saw those parchments again, we felt them loom, like judgments waiting to descend. The worst came not from what was said, but from what was made of the silence. One woman, Tala, stepped forward and said nothing. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. The commissar waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then he stepped forward and placed his hand on her chest, as if searching for something beneath the skin. When he withdrew, he nodded once to the attendant servitor. Tala was dragged behind the fuel silos. We never saw her again, but for days afterward we heard a metallic groaning echo from that direction, wet, arrhythmic like breath forced through broken vents. There was no question of rebellion. We had already surrendered our voices, and rebellion requires something left unspoken. The line marched forward. Confessions continued. Each admission seemed to peel something from us. Dignity, selfhood, memory, until we became reflections of the Manufactorum itself. No interior, only moving parts. And yet there was something else, something that listened, behind the eyes of the commissar, beneath the robes of the priests, within the recording quills. I could feel it watching through my words, parsing not for sin but for shape, for architecture. The more we confessed, the more it learned how we were built, not to purify us, to replicate us. The day ended with silence, not ordered, natural, earned, nothing left to say. That night the lights flickered in perfect sync with the heartbeat beneath the floor. Not offbeat, not delayed, 1-to-1. It had learned the rhythm, and it had begun to respond. They began to trade in ash. Not for warmth or scarcity or ritual, but for resilience. Whispered beneath breaths and offered with cupped palms, the ash was scraped from the sides of Furnace 10 and hoarded like relics. It had changed since the breach, darker, heavier, clinging to skin in a way that left it humming faintly under touch. Some said it had weight beyond mass, that it remembered. Those who inhaled it said less but endured more. Blisters healed faster, muscle strain dulled. They worked longer hours without pause, eyes sunken but steady. Their prayers were brief and silent. They didn't cough. They didn't bleed. They didn't dream. I watched as one of them, Jasser, a rail-thin man once too weak to lift casing, dragged a forge hammer across a jammed press and brought it down with such force the gantry beneath him cracked. His nose bled afterward, but he wiped it away with the back of his ash-covered hand and kept moving. When asked what had given him strength, he simply said, "It listens to me now." No one questioned him. He was moved to furnace maintenance by morning. Promoted, some said. Sacrificed, said others. The ash became currency. In dark corners behind rusted turbines, small bowls were passed, pinches exchanged for favors, an extra ration, a shift trade, a moment of silence. We knew it wasn't sanctioned. We knew the priests would have flayed us for it had they not vanished into their sealed upper ducts days prior. But with the doors welded shut and doctrine gone mute, belief shifted like liquid into the cracks of utility. Some smeared it across their faces before work, drawing lines beneath their eyes like war paint. Others mixed it into the slurry to bind it deeper. The effect was never the same. For some, it brought clarity, an eerie calm in the chaos. For others, convulsions, screaming fits, static leaking from the mouth like corrupted Vox transmissions. I saw a man claw his own mask apart and laugh while doing it, face blackened, teeth shining like polished chrome. He did not stop laughing until his throat tore. And yet no one intervened. No commissars broke the gatherings. No enforcers fired warning shots. Those who had once kept order now averted their eyes or joined the trades in secret. Even the servitors passed through ash-thick air without pause, trailing footprints that glowed faintly under lumen flicker. The Manufactorum accepted it, or perhaps it had always expected it. The ash clung to everything now, our uniforms, our skin, the walls themselves. Every breath was a taste of memory, of what had burned, of what had survived the fire. I began to wonder if we were still breathing air at all, or if we had merely adapted like the machines we fed. Function over flesh, faith over thought, ash over bone. That night I awoke to find my palms coated in it, thick and damp though I had not touched the furnace. The hum beneath the floor had risen in pitch. It was no longer listening. It was whispering back. It was Varric, finally. I had not seen him since the first tremor in Furnace 10, not since the day his human eye fogged over and his augmetic arm had twitched violently before going still. Rumors had circulated in hushed tones among the remaining line crews. Some said he had been taken by the Manufactorum itself, absorbed into the rhythm of the machines. Others whispered that he had walked into the ducts willingly, drawn by a curiosity no human should survive. I did not believe either version until the day I saw him. He appeared in the central hall, leaning against a bulkhead as if it were a chair. Half of his body was familiar, augmetic limbs polished, lenses blinking mechanically. But the human half was grotesque. Flesh and metal fused unnaturally, veins fused with tubing and muscles fused with pistons. The skin pulsed, gray and shining under the lumen strips, as though it were still alive but controlled by some other command. I froze. None of the servitors reacted. None of the priests or what remained of them emerged. The Manufactorum treated him as part of the machinery, not as a man. Varric moved slowly down the line, mechanical arm adjusting valves, human arm twitching unpredictably. Guardsman stepped aside. We whispered his name, though sound seemed insufficient. One man, braver or more foolish than the rest, asked him if he was alive. His head turned with impossible speed, eye lens and human eye aligning, and he spoke, not in words, but in a series of clicks and hums that resonated along the metal floor. The sound was intelligible only to the machines. The conveyor belt slowed as if listening. It was clear then. He was no longer a man. He was a host, a conduit for whatever had emerged from Furnace 10, a hybrid of human flesh and industrial will. The contamination that had killed, convulsed, and reshaped others had not merely passed through him. It had anchored. Varric's presence explained the earlier disappearances, the precision of the line despite dwindling numbers, the way the Manufactorum seemed to anticipate our movements. He had become its agent, its embodiment, a warning and an enforcer in one. We watched silently as he adjusted pressures, sealed micro cracks, and tended to furnaces with a tension no human could maintain. The rhythm beneath the floor pulsed in time with him now, not merely the machinery. Every lever, every wheel, every valve he touched vibrated with a life of its own. Those who tried to speak fell silent under his gaze. Some fainted, a few coughed blood. None survived long enough to ask questions. I realized then the truth of our situation. Varric had become the Manufactorum incarnate. The overseer we had feared and obeyed was now a living emblem of the system's design. Efficiency enforced at all costs, bodies subsumed, individuality erased, obedience encoded into muscle, sinew, and steel. The line no longer needed us, not for labor, not for supervision, not for confession. It needed only him. And as he turned his head, half man, half machine, I understood that the contagion had a guardian. Not for mercy, not for protection, but to ensure the Manufactorum consumed everything in its path, and that nothing, not blood, not ash, not breath, would ever escape its rhythm again. The audit arrived like a shadow, silent and methodical. They did not come to inspect our bodies or to render aid. They came with ledgers, with calibration instruments, and with the implacable gaze of the Imperium's bureaucratic machinery. A fleet of servitors accompanied them, moving in perfect formation, carrying data slates and measurement devices calibrated to the smallest deviation. They swept through the Manufactorum, their presence cold, clinical, and completely indifferent to the lives still slumped across the gantries. Each of us was measured against quotas, output tallied, and deviations marked as failures of efficiency. The audit officers did not flinch at the bodies twisted in unnatural poses or the ash-caked corpses pinned beneath conveyor belts. They only noted, only recorded. Each death was a numerical deduction, each collapse a minor aberration to be logged and corrected. Human cost was irrelevant. What mattered was production. I watched as Varric moved among them, guiding him or them. It was impossible to discern. Half of him functioned as overseer, half as machine, and the auditors made no attempt to speak to the human portion. They recorded only the outcomes. He adjusted valves, recalibrated furnaces, and set micro-corrective pulses that maintained rhythm in places where no worker remained alive. His presence ensured that the Manufactorum's efficiency was not broken, even if it meant consuming every last living thing in the line. Names were read aloud from the ledgers. Some were alive, most were not. A man who had been a friend to me was listed as an operational deficiency. The auditors noted it, marked the box, and moved on. The term hung in the air like acid. Operational deficiency. It was a phrase without compassion, yet perfectly descriptive. It described exactly what the Manufactorum demanded. Not bodies, not loyalty, not survival, but utility. Anything else was irrelevant. We were processed as if we had been part of the machinery all along. Our confessions, our trading of ash, our whispered panic, all were irrelevant to the ledger. Survival meant nothing if output was insufficient. The auditors moved through the hallways without hesitation, their instruments tracing thermal signatures, counting microvariances, measuring the beat beneath the floors. Every rhythm, every pulse of the Manufactorum was captured, catalogued, and quantified. And still, it pulsed. The hum beneath the floor rose slightly with each measurement, as if aware of its scrutiny. Varric guided it, calibrated it, absorbed it. We were standing witnesses to a system that had learned to subsume all life into its own perpetuation. Any semblance of humanity had already been archived, reduced to metrics, and consigned to oblivion. By the end of the cycle, the auditors departed, leaving the Manufactorum intact and unbroken. No one cheered, no one lamented. The line continued, the ash continued to trade hands, and the pulse beneath the floor continued to grow. The Manufactorum had endured scrutiny without compromise. And in that endurance, it had reminded us all of a single unflinching truth. Life within these walls was measured not by living but by usefulness, and only the rhythm mattered. I am no longer certain where the Manufactorum ends and where I begin. Each day I stand at the line, my hands moving in rhythm with levers and presses, my lungs drawing ash-laden air as naturally as they once drew clean oxygen. The pulse beneath the floor has become part of me. I can feel it in my chest, in my feet, in the tips of my fingers. It is a second heartbeat, relentless and patient, counting the moments between work cycles and death alike. The ash remains my currency, my conduit, my talisman. I smear it on my face each morning, not to protect, not to hide, but to synchronize. Those who inhale too much are removed, their bodies recycled into the line or fed into the furnaces. We do not ask questions. We do not speak their names. Silence has become a doctrine as rigid as any mechanical code. Varric moves still, though I rarely see him. Half man, half machine, he is everywhere and nowhere. The line obeys him more than any supervisor ever could. He anticipates failures, corrects deviations, and absorbs the pulse. I follow, mimicking his motions, learning the rhythm he enforces. I have come to understand that to survive is to move with him, not merely beside him. Occasionally I hear the whispers of those who fell. Garen, Tala, Hendrik, they are not gone. Their absence haunts the machinery, echoes through the ash, flickers in the lumen strips. I feel their presence in the tremors beneath the floor, in the slight vibrations along my spine, in the metallic taste that never leaves my tongue. The Manufactorum remembers them, archives them, and yet it is not memory. It is calculation, observation, and perfect control. The auditor's visit has become legend among the remaining crew. We speak of it only in thought. Numbers, efficiency, and pulse were the only things that mattered to them. Life and death were incidental, mere variables in the equation. I know now that our survival depends less on skill than on compliance with an order we can barely comprehend. To exist as units of labor, integrated, indistinguishable from the machinery itself. I dream rarely, and when I do, it is not of open skies or warm sunlight. It is of gears turning infinitely, of furnaces that breathe, of ash flowing like blood through the veins of the floor. In my dreams, Varric walks beside me, guiding my hands, teaching me to move as one with the pulse. And when I awake, I realize that I am already learning, already a part of the rhythm that devours all and preserves nothing. 14. The Manufactorum has become my prison and my temple. I move along the gantries as if suspended between worlds, flesh and augmetic limbs sync to rhythm, eyes tracing the levers and valves that demand attention. There is no longer a line between obedience and instinct. I act without thought, guided by the pulse beneath the floor, by the echo of ash against steel, by the memory of those who cannot speak. Each shift begins with the air thick, charged, heavy. The ash swirls and eddies around our boots, sticking to uniforms and skin alike. I inhale it knowingly, aware that its presence sharpens my motion, steadies my hands, and bridges the gap between calculation and survival. Others falter. I have learned not to aid them. Survival in the Manufactorum is a solitary contract with the rhythm that guides us. I watch Varric sometimes, though his form has become more shadow than substance. Half the room sees a man, half sees a machine, and some see both simultaneously. He moves without hesitation, correcting misalignments before they manifest, guiding furnaces that have no master, adjusting valves that demand perfection. I mimic him step for step, learning his methods, internalizing the pulse that he has mastered. Confession rituals are obsolete. Ash trades are silent. The line operates itself, guided by a consciousness that is no longer human but retains a memory of what once was. I have become its witness, its servant, its extension. My eyes scan for minor deviations, my hands respond to tremors I cannot see. I have become part of the calculation. There is no fear now, only awareness. The voices of the lost linger faintly, Garen, Tala, Hendrik, but they are echoes of a protocol, not reminders of humanity. Their presence is encoded in the pulse, in the vibrations of floor and wall, in the metallic taste that lingers with every breath. We exist as nodes in the Manufactorum's mind, coordinated, unflinching, unbroken. And yet, in the still moments between cycles, I feel the weight of absence. I feel the cost of continuity, the lives consumed for rhythm, the ghosts recorded in ash. There is no rescue, there is no mercy, there is only the line, the pulse, and the endless demand of a system that requires everything and returns nothing. I continue my work, I continue my rhythm, I inhale ash, I move with the pulse, I obey the line, and as the furnaces burn, the machinery hums and Varric guides what remains, I understand. Survival is not triumph, survival is assimilation. And the Manufactorum is eternal. The siren never stops. Even now, years after the initial breach, its metallic wail persists in my memory, ringing beneath the humming of furnaces and the groan of steel beams. I no longer need to hear it to obey it. The Manufactorum pulses through me, every motion a reflection of its will, every breath a measure of its rhythm. I am both watcher and participant, servant and extension. There is no line between myself and the machinery, only continuity, only function. The ash has become more than a substance. It is a map of survival, a ledger of the lost, a medium through which the Manufactorum communicates. I smear it on my hands and face, on the gloves that grip levers, on the masks that filter the air. The taste is metallic, familiar, and I have grown to interpret it as instruction. Each inhalation calibrates me, aligns me with the pulse beneath the floor, and reminds me that life here is secondary to motion. Those who cannot endure the ash are removed quietly, their absence recorded, their names struck from memory. The rhythm remains unbroken. Varric has vanished from sight, though I know he moves still. His presence is felt in the subtle corrections, in the anticipatory adjustments, in the precise alignment of furnaces and presses. He is no longer a man or machine, but a nexus, a node of control within the living mechanism of the Manufactorum. I follow his lead instinctively, mimicking his movements, internalizing his timing. Each day I feel less like a man and more like an instrument, tuned and sharpened for output, with consciousness an artifact rather than a requirement. The auditors have long departed. Their ledgers, their measurements, their indifferent calculations remain etched in memory, proof that human oversight is irrelevant to the Manufactorum's endurance. Production continues as if guided by a logic beyond comprehension, consuming lives, redistributing ash, and maintaining order without pause. Those who remain are ghosts, not of mortality but of obedience, moving in synchrony with the pulse that has outlasted every voice, every prayer, every fear. At night I walk the gantries alone. The furnaces burn steadily, indifferent, feeding heat and ash into the halls. I trace the edges of conduits, check valves that no one will correct, breathe the charged air, and feel the rhythm of the pulse in my chest. There is no reflection, no mourning. There is only endurance, only the unbroken flow of labor and observation, only the whisper of ash against skin and steel. I understand now that survival is not choice. It is assimilation. The Manufactorum has claimed us all, mind, body, and spirit, and in exchange it grants continuity. There is no escape, no reprieve, no final reckoning. We endure because we must, because the pulse commands it, because the line never ends. And so I move, inhaling ash, feeling the beat beneath my feet, hands and mind attuned to the eternal rhythm of the Manufactorum, and I continue.